This is in addition to my last talk on the knowledge of good and evil. So please listen to that part one so that this will fit in the full context. What I wanted to clarify here or expand on is the important point that the idea that God is irrational and that rationality is not important is not only false, but it's blasphemous and it's actually sabotage for your life if you believe it. So in part one, I did point out that I believe I said that it's blasphemous to say that God is irrational. And I explained how they twist that blasphemy into praise, where they would have you believe that to say that God is beyond reason is just a form of praise and that you recognize that he is so powerful that, he's beyond reason. It's a false dichotomy. It's not that either God is supernatural or he's reasonable. He's both. He's not against sound reasoning. And actually, we need to be aligned with sound reasoning in order to align with his will. So the idea that you can basically abandon logic and feel good about it because you're just living in revelation, right? As the preacher I mentioned said that, he incorrectly was preaching this idea that God doesn't want us to be concerned about reason or logic. He just wants us to live in revelation, right? So they present it to you as if it's this wonderful theology, right? It's this wonderful religious perception where you're just beyond logic, right? And you might think that it kind of has some truth to it because you might think, well, if God can work miracles, that's beyond reason. But that's careless thinking, because just because we can't fully understand God's power, that doesn't mean that it has to contradict reason, or it doesn't mean that there isn't reason to it. It's just beyond our understanding, right? Like a child who's just growing up, all kinds of things in the world seem beyond reason, right? All kinds of things to a child seems, you could say, just magical or totally without any logic to them. But that's not that they don't actually have a reason to them. It's just that the child doesn't understand what that reasoning is, right? So it's very possible for God to be 100% aligned with logic and rationality, but also exercise a power that at times we don't fully understand how it's operating, right? But that doesn't mean that it ever actually contradicts logic, right? Just because it's at a higher level or it's, dealing with metaphysics that are beyond our current understanding, that doesn't mean that it has to contradict reason, right? So it's a false dichotomy once again. It's always this propaganda that is sabotage, and it's always utilizing logical fallacies to deceive you into believing it, right? Where the logical fallacy seems kind of legitimate, right? Like inherited sin doctrine seems kind of like, oh, it's just the correct, humble view, when in fact it's blasphemous, immoral sabotage, as I explained in part one and elsewhere. This idea that God is beyond reason and, just forget about reason can seem kind of correct, right? Like at first glance, it just seems like, well, it's just saying that God is all powerful. No, that's not what it's saying. Like you really have to be more careful when you're thinking. It's saying that God is irrational. Saying that God is irrational is not equivalent to saying God is all powerful. Those are separate ideas. And they're conflating the two. They're telling you that the two are the same. They're saying that to believe in his supernatural power is also to believe in his irrationality. That's false. It's a false equivalency. And it's satanic sabotage, right? This is no small matter. If you think logic, well, so first of all, it's terrible because it's blasphemous. That's big reason number one why this forget about reason and think that God isn't aligned with rationality idea is terrible. That's big terrible reason number one. Big terrible reason number two is because we absolutely need to exercise our rationality in order to be aligned with salvation. If you're irrational, you're delusional, right? If you're irrational, what's another word for being completely irrational? It's being crazy, right? If you're completely crazy, how are you going to see the sense of what Jesus taught, right? How are you going to see the sense of right and wrong, right? How are you going to reason correctly as far as aligning with God's guidance and grace, right? If you're completely irrational, you're not going to be able to do that, right? How are you going to be able to conquer toxic emotion thoughts like fear, right? As I explained in detail in my guidebook about conquering fear, I point out that one of the main forms that fear takes as a thought form is an irrational thought. And so if you abandon rationality, you're not going to be able to conquer the irrational form of fear, right? If you think irrationality is just a-okay, well then anytime a toxic irrational thought enters your mind, you're probably going to go with it, right? Because you're not exercising your reason. You're not exercising your logic, which is a God-given quality, right? It's a gift from God, our reason, along with our conscience, right? Our sense of right and wrong. These are gifts to be utilized, not abandoned. Right? But they tell you, abandoning your logic is actually a form of praise, right? Abandoning your conscience, that's actually a good thing. Right? It's satanic sabotage. These are devilish teachings that are unfortunately what make up much of what's mainstream Christianity. It's completely against what Christ taught. It's anti-Christ. Right? He taught us to be aligned with true morality, with reason, right? With the truth that can set us free. Not to embrace irrationality, embrace immorality, embrace lies. Right? We need logic in order to see through the deceptions of the enemy. Right? That's a major way in which we can determine that it's a deception. It's how we can see the works of the enemy and conquer them, right? Like I was saying concerning fear, which is actually demonic. But you're never going to recognize that fear is completely demonic unless you exercise your reason, unless you get really logical about it in your analysis, logical analysis, critical thinking. So I could go on about why logic is important, but hopefully you already recognize that to some degree, right? I mean, I don't think the average person is going to say, logic is useless. Hopefully most people recognize there's some value there. So this teaching that God doesn't care about logic, God is irrational, again, twisted into praise, right? They conflate it with recognizing his supernatural power. Again, that's a false equivalency. Yes, God has supernatural power, but that does not mean that God has to be irrational. And just because we don't understand how the metaphysics works doesn't mean that it isn't actually rational. It's just a higher level of understanding that we don't have, but it doesn't contradict our lower understanding, right? In no way is it an exercise in irrationality, right? So if you believe in like miraculous power, Christians oftentimes say, well, it's beyond reason, it's beyond, no, it's beyond understanding, your current understanding, but that's not beyond reason, right? So that's the mix-up. It can seem like semantics or, like no big deal. It's a huge deal. If you're equating lack of understanding with irrationality, that's a major error. Logic is 100% necessary and good, and God in no way is irrational. And everything he does is aligned with reason, just as it's aligned with perfect virtue. Right? Everything he does is perfectly good and perfectly rational. There's no irrationality to it. There's no immorality to it. And just because we don't always understand how that is so, just because we're not omniscient as he is, doesn't mean that he's not being consistent in his morality and his rationality. So I hope this clarification on why the idea that God is irrational or that reason doesn't matter is a terrible teaching. It's, I think, actually worthy of the designation satanic because of its blasphemous nature and also because of its sabotaging to your salvation nature, right? It's completely wicked. It's blasphemous slander towards the Creator, and then simultaneously causing you to stumble on your path because you're believing that you should forget about a core or key component that you need to utilize for your salvation, right? Just like morality is absolutely crucial, so is logic. We need to exercise our logic and our morality to the full extent in order to overcome our delusions and our mistakes and align with the truth, the way, and the life. All right, thank you for listening.